Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last day of the AFS Global Conference. We hope you have been enjoying yourself so far. We hope you have been connecting with many people and being inspired by the great minds that we have here. We have a great last day for you. We're going to start with two amazing panels. We have several concurrent sessions that will follow, and then we will end with another plenary session in the afternoon. And there are actually some very lucky people in this room who get to go and enjoy a Hungarian host family dinner, really taste the AFS experience. I'm really envious of those people because many of us AFSers actually transition into some internal discussions in the evening, while some of you will be enjoying this beautiful city. But before you get to do that, we do want to make sure that we continue inspiring each other and figure out ways of taking this movement forward. I want to tell you about a couple numbers. We have more than 400 people here from 70 countries, but we are reaching a much broader audience. We have more than 500 posts on our AFSCon hashtag that has reached more than 26,000 people outside of this room. Thank you. And we do want to encourage those tweeters, those Instagrammers to continue doing that. Please spread the word. Please try to involve as many people as possible. Yesterday, we had 2 AFS Now sessions. Some of you were able to watch them live, and many people actually online tuned in. And I'm happy to say that more than 2,000 people watched those streams already. And they will be on our channels, and we will also spread them with you so that other people can listen into those important discussions. All right, I won't take much of your time. I know you're all excited to listen to the panels that are going to come up very soon. But before that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you one of my dear colleagues, Anna Carolina.
Bom dia. Good morning, everyone. Globalizing schools, internationalizing schools, multicultural education, intercultural education, global citizenship education, intercultural learning. And these are just a few of the terms that our movement uses to describe what we do in English. It's been suggested this week that one reason our movement is not growing as quickly as world event demands is that the world of global competence education uses many different terms, concepts, tools, and assessments. And, as with all things, different terms mean different things to different people. This, in turn, makes it very difficult to achieve alignment among different stakeholders and connect with the decision makers we need to influence. Mobilizing a movement requires a common understanding of the problems, solutions, and assessments in order for us to be aligned. However, absolute agreement and sameness are not necessary to build effective coalitions. So let's start today's conversation agreeing that one size does not fit all, nor does it need to meet our goals. Alignment also requires researchers and practitioners to move out of our silos to find a common ground to grow and scale this movement together. In many ways, the leaders of this field, all of us, need to use our own global competence to foster meaningful collaboration across the differences to truly impact and create the impact that we truly desire. So now it's time to invite Darla Deardorff, in our first panel. Darla is the executive director of the Association of International Education Administrators and an expert on intercultural research. Welcome, Darla.
Thank you, Anna Carolina. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here this morning. What a fantastic conference and time it's been together. I'd like to start by telling you a brief story. Earlier this week, I was working on a UNESCO project on intercultural competence in a middle school in Vienna, not too far away from here. And this school is around 80% migrant student background. And we were working with them on a methodology for furthering intercultural competence development. The students were actively and eagerly participating and engaged. And at the end, one of the students said that this was the first time that he ever really felt heard by his peers. Think about it, the first time that he's ever felt heard by his peers, by others. And so this reminded me then of when we heard the student here speak earlier this week, very eloquently about the importance of listening to students' voices. And so I'd like to come back to this point, and as educators and volunteers and administrators, we need to think about how much time do we spend listening to our students and working with them. If we're really serious about moving forward on global competence, we must involve everyone, and especially our students. It's such a crucial voice that we need to be listening to, and the students are a really key partner that we need to be working with. So as we think about ways to continue moving this forward, I would encourage us to continue to search and seek and listen to students as a really key stakeholder in all of this. And then as we look further in terms of the landscape that we've been talking about this week, I just wanted to highlight or summarize kind of a few key developments that we're seeing around the world and around global and intercultural competence. Certainly yesterday we heard about OECD and the work that's being done on PISA global competence. UNESCO is also working on this as well, as I mentioned on the project that they're doing, which is really gaining momentum as they pilot this project in all 5 UNESCO regions in both formal and non-formal contexts. Regionally, we see organizations like the Council of Europe contributing excellent resources in developing intercultural and global competence, such as their recent study on competencies needed for democratic society, and a resource such as their online activity book, co-authored by one of the conference participants here, Ildiko Lazar. Some governments have also been active in this area, for example, with the Chinese and Japanese governments, emphasizing the importance of intercultural competence and global talent. And even in my own country, the US Department of Education has developed a framework for global and cultural competence. We've heard businesses are clamoring for employees that have these vital intercultural skills, as Andreas mentioned yesterday. And there are organizations like the Asia Society and AFS who are doing phenomenal work in terms of intercultural learning, and you'll hear shortly from one of my colleagues from the Asia Society more about this. Global competence is indeed emerging as a key outcome for universities around the world. And in fact, an Australian colleague and I recently published a book with 29 case studies involving how universities around the world are developing and assessing intercultural and global competence in many different ways. And then coming back to the point I said earlier, one of the really interesting points of these case studies that we found is that a common theme through the case studies in terms of assessment was the use of peer assessment and the involvement of students in their own intercultural competence development. So that brings us to looking at where are we now, what's being done, what's happening, how can we continue to move forward with this? I would like to say that despite the challenges that we face with an increased nationalistic political climates around the world, that the movement toward global and intercultural competence is robust. And while more is needed, it's exciting to hear about the current developments that are happening. And I am pleased to be joined today by a group of panelists who will be sharing with us more about how they see this evolvement moving forward. And so at this time, I would like to invite our 3 panelists to come forward, and we'll hear from them more about how this is moving forward in the future. Thank you very much for joining me here. I'd like to start by asking each of you to describe how your research or work is connected to intercultural competence, and in which ways we might facilitate the development of intercultural competence. So Francesca, let's start with you. As the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator for CONCORD, which is a European NGO confederation for relief and development, you've been involved with projects related to global citizenship education. Can you say more about your work and how this is related to intercultural competence and our discussions here at this conference?
Thank you, Darla. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you. I'm, let's say, an outsider because I don't come from the education sector. I represent CONCORD, which is an umbrella organization. We represent more than 2,600 NGOs working on development cooperation in Europe and abroad. And among all the different topics we work on and different issues our members, they work together on, we have an important piece on global citizenship education. It used to be called development education, global education, and now we are trying more and more to use this UNESCO definition, global citizenship. Why? Because we feel that to live in an interconnected world and to be able to share with everybody, especially in Europe, what we do as NGOs, we need the support of citizens, we need informed citizens, from young people to older ones, and our role as NGOs is for sure much more important and effective if we work with global citizenship education, trying to promote it as much as possible. The work we do in Europe is a work that is trying to bring together experts and practitioners from all around Europe. So what CONCORD is doing primarily in Brussels is working with the European institutions, trying to keep them accountable on what they do, what they promise. And also we are trying to connect the European level with the national ones. So NGOs, from the very big ones, big names like, I don't know, Oxfam Save the Children, ActionAid, to the very small ones, local NGOs that are active in their town or small municipalities. We think that NGOs are really an important stakeholder, and they should work more with policymakers and institutions, especially to promote and to enhance global citizenship education. That's why I'm here, and I thank the organizers for inviting me. We published a study on global citizenship education funding, and I will be glad to share with you also what we do on assessments as NGOs, because of course NGOs, normally we don't go from research to practice, but the other way around. We go from practice to research, but I'm happy to be here with you, and thanks for the introduction.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Now we turn to Dr. Mattia Baiutti, who is a researcher and trainer at Intercultura Foundation in Italy. And his research has focused on intercultural competence in secondary school exchange, as well as in teacher training. So Mattia, can you say more about how your research is connected to intercultural competence, and in what ways it might facilitate the development of this competence further?
Thank you, Darla. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to AFS to invite me to be here. At Intercultura Foundation, we are running several researches linking to different topics. My topic is usually linked to assessment, intercultural competence of student mobility, as Darla say, from the perspective of the teachers. And why we do this? Because in Italy, the year that the students spend abroad, it's legally recognized, which is not necessarily common in all countries, as we know. And according to the Italian legislation, the Italian teacher has the duty to assess the student when they come back. And in order to do this, they have to take into account during the assessment process disciplinary competence, but as well transversal competence such as intercultural competence. And however, with several research that we conducted, we saw that teachers unfortunately pay attention only on knowledge and disciplinary knowledge. And the reason is because basically they use still the paradigm of knowledge rather than the paradigm of competence. And in this sense, they don't know exactly how to assess the competence. This is just a general thought, obviously. It's not for all, but this is what emerged from our researches. And at the same time, we saw that teachers might play the crucial role in order to develop a culture of student mobility within the schools, but sometimes, some of them, they might be the main obstacle because they have their own prejudice around student mobility, how they go to holidays, or because in that country they don't do Latin or philosophy. How can you survive in Italy without this? So we decided to work with schools and do something in order to foster the assessment of intercultural competence. And we started for a very basic rule in assessment, which is before to assess, we need to understand what we want to assess. So we try to identify with the qualitative research several indicators that might help teachers in order to assess the intercultural competence of the student. And I would like to underline this is really specific for secondary school student mobility. And I'm pleased to say that we just published in Intercultural Education Journal this indicator in English. And this was the starting point. It was a good starting point, but then we say it's not enough. And so we started to run another research, an action research. We call this research Intercultura Assessment Protocol. And the aim of the research is to create a model, meaning some tools and also a rubric to assess this intercultural competence of the students. And we involve more than 100 teachers from all Italy, that they have one student abroad, so they can use the tools and they give us feedback to refine the models that we design. And also we involve some international experts, in particular for the rubric, to validate qualitatively the rubric. So we are now in the last phases of this research. And what I would like to share with you is that behind the model that we designed, we had some impact on the school. We already have some impacts, like, for example, obviously the teacher that was part of their research, they learned theory about intercultural competence, student mobility. But the good point is that the majority of them, during the focus group and the questionnaires that we did for collecting data, they say that they bring this knowledge within their institution. So they spread the knowledge on intercultural competence and student mobility, and in this way they create some culture of student mobility. And also, during the research, I always ask the teacher to try to involve the colleagues. And another good point was that they declared that some of them, they reviewed their idea, the prejudice around student mobility. So this is the way that we do the research. We found some practical models that the teacher can use, but at the same time, we are trying to foster in the culture of student mobility and cultural education within the schools.
Thank you very much, Mattia. And now we turn to Dr. Maja Nenadović, who is the Secretary General of the International Association of Intercultural Education, which brings together researchers, educators, and practitioners in working in the field of intercultural education. So Maja, what are you seeing in your work as it relates to global competence, and what strategies should educators and administrators focus on based on that work?
Thank you. I do have to make a distinction that I'm sometimes speaking as myself and sometimes as IAIE because it is only one of the hats that I hold. So in that sense, it would be maybe unfair to interpret my statements as statements official of the International Association for Intercultural Education. In my work, the element that I see most often that pertains to global competence is something that I think we didn't talk about enough at this conference yet. There were fleeting mentions. You yourself mentioned that we live in an era of growing nationalism, but I do believe that's something that school administrators as well as practitioners trying to foster global competence at this moment should focus on, is getting the students not to be afraid. Not to be afraid of the other. Because whether we like it or not, social media and general media are absolutely filled with demonization, dehumanization, and vilification of certain groups in society. And I don't know if I'm addressing the elephant in the room or being the spokesperson of that elephant at the moment, but we are having this conference in a country that has made explicit, very loud statements against accepting migrants and refugees in Europe. And one of the things that I think we should focus on currently in Europe, but also obviously elsewhere in the world, because this is not a uniquely European situation, is I think we should take this opportunity, because I do see it as an opportunity, to foster global competence by finding ways to integrate refugee children into classrooms throughout Europe. Because this is one of the ways that you're and I see this as an opportunity because we spoke yesterday, and Hazar also mentioned it, we spoke about fundraising. Well, I'm not that good in economics, but I'm pretty sure that it's cheaper to work on integrating and working with students from foreign backgrounds currently in our countries than it is to send students for an exchange year to another country abroad. So in that sense, I believe that there is a missed opportunity there. Global competences, we've only spoken about the positive competences, so to speak, and we've said that empathy is important. Well, empathy is incredibly important, but I do believe that empathy is not built by talking about empathy.
Thank you very much for some very thought-provoking ideas and comments. As we were talking yesterday in preparing for this panel, we found that one of the common threads that all four of us had was around assessment. And so as we look to successful practices related to global competence in different contexts, one of the key questions that comes up, and I've heard it already numerous times here at this conference, is about assessment and how to assess. Mattia, you already spoke a bit about it just now. While there may be over 140 different assessment tools that measure various aspects of global and intercultural assessment, research shows that there's no one-size-fits-all. And further, with the work being done through OECD's Education 2030 efforts, along with other research, it may be time to rethink assessment. Certainly as the assessment paradigm is shifting from assessment tools themselves to more around the lines of authentic evidence and looking at what is the authentic evidence of what we do, and possibly even through the integration of students into the classrooms in better ways. So as we think about this, I'd like to invite each of you to respond to this question. How do we reframe the debate around assessment in a way that helps move the needle on fostering intercultural competence? So as you think about this question, Francesca, we come back to you and welcome your thoughts on this question.
Thank you, Darla, for the question. I have to admit, especially working on the European level and with the European Union institutions, assessment is really a buzzword. It's something that policymakers, politicians, they really like. And that's why impact assessments, especially for Eurocrats, is very important, because before implementing policies, you need to assess their results, their effectiveness ex ante, so you need to assess before. The NGO sector and NGOs, especially the ones working on education, on global citizenship education, not all the time have the means to properly run assessments before starting a project, before targeting some groups. Why? Because to do a proper assessment, I think you need also good means. Enough funding, enough experts, and enough time. And I have to tell you that in general, in Europe, NGOs we don't have this luxury. We don't have a lot of time, we don't have a lot of resources, but we are trying to make the best use of what we have. So you mentioned already peer-to-peer learning. I think also while doing assessments before starting a project, before brainstorming on ideas and then putting them into practice, we are very good in trying to share knowledge and best practices, and this is one of the very good resources we have. European NGOs especially, because we come with such a so rich, diverse background, we manage to bring to the table different experiences. And I think we should do more and more sharing. We should consider to work more in networks, in partnership. One of the things that also in the Sustainable Development Goals, the last SDG is precisely about partnership, working together, better together, because also in this way you really can be more effective and reach better results. So one of the important reflections that at least European NGOs are trying to bring, to carry on those days, those weeks and those months, is precisely how to work better together, also an assessment. And I just want to mention, because we are in an important historical moment, there will be soon European Parliament elections, so in Europe there will be an important change, new people elected in the Parliament, a new European Commission that for Europeans, but not only, it's an important, very important institutions. We hope that assessment will continue to be a central element also of the work of policymakers, international policymakers, and for sure NGOs will ask for a more precise and more informative assessments also before implementing policies and designing policies. So the work of NGOs being the watchdog of European institutions, but also at national level in every member state, will ask for more and better assessments, I think, and we will try to share our experiences as well with them.
Thank you, Francesca. Mattia, what are you seeing, what lessons learned that we can take from your work on research with assessment?
Well, assessment is a tricky word because assessment means different things in different culture contexts, but as well in the same culture contents, sometimes we perceive or we understand in a different way. If I look assessment from the school context, at least in Italy, it seems that assessment is one of the most important part into the school. If you think students and parents, they care more about marks than the learning sometimes. But what I usually argue is that even if a student got the best marks in all the disciplinary, but it's racist, then the school and the society failed. So we should, as you say, to rethink the concept of assessment, and I guess that what we are missing now is the educational value of assessment. So we should to rethink again assessment as an educative tool, is a part of the learning journal. And in this sense, for example, in our Intercultura protocol, we usually use the multi-method approach, so we are using different tools. One tools are for peer assessment, for example, but what was interesting is that from the data, teachers think that these tools are useful to collect data in order to fill in the rubric. But what they say as well is that some of these tools are like a space for the student to stop what they are living or what they lived, to think about. So they reflect on the experience that they do or they did, and in this way they develop their own intercultural competence. The main part that they achieve with this reflection is awareness, self-awareness, and also cultural awareness. So in this sense, the protocol that we design is mainly linked to assessment, but in a way that is an educative assessment. So I guess this might be important in this. And it's important, I mean, because we did as a foundation this work, but it was really important, we say, to connect, to involve students, but as well the teachers, because they were the important stakeholder in student mobility, and sometimes we forgot this.
Thank you very much. And Maja, your thoughts on intercultural competence assessment in your work?
I'll keep it brief because we're getting a sign from the audience. Okay, so please don't get me wrong. I have a PhD in impact evaluation, but at the same time, I'm going to tell you, I think we're approaching it the completely wrong way. The work that we're in, fostering global competence, I don't think it can be measured that well through quantitative data collection methodologies. And I think that we are focusing far too much on them. I think that we are ignoring, for whatever reason, far richer data that we can collect through qualitative data collection methodologies, because essentially I think that what we're trying to measure here is the element of a transformative experience. Every single one of you will probably remember with clarity your first international seminar or your first international summer camp. An experience that probably shaped your life in such a way that probably put it in a different direction. So in that sense, with impact evaluation, I would like us to focus on a little bit more longitudinal studies. So talking to students a couple of years after their particular experiences to see in what way these experiences shaped the course of their life afterwards. Second of all, I think we should find a way to design monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that reinforce impact. Because I think that one of the competencies we're trying to foster in students is also self-reflection. And I think that if M&E design is done properly, we can actually reinforce impact by doing that.
Thank you very much for such a rich discussion. And there's so much more that could be said. We want to turn now to you, our colleagues, to see what questions you may have, what questions were stimulated from what you've heard this morning from our panelists. And we have time for perhaps one or two questions. And so we look forward to hearing from you. Yes, please.
Great. My name is Christian Mehta. I'm on the US board. I'd like to go back to Maya's very provocative question earlier about the elephant in the room, about the fact that in many societies around the world, including the United States, where I'm living, the societies are very polarized and aggravated by social media, as you point out, for people to keep to their views and to reject other people's views. I wonder if in that environment, is there a new or a renewed role for AFS to promote better cultural understanding, whether it is through domestic exchanges or whether it is through more innovative or creative ways to articulate what are some solutions here, because if the societies continue to be polarized, we are all defeating the purpose for which organizations like AFS were founded, which was to promote better understanding and to prevent more conflict and wars. So I wonder if you can comment from a research perspective or a qualitative perspective, Maja, what are some ways in which we can think more creatively about the way forward in these very turbulent times?
Thank you for your question. I would not presume to set a new course for AFS. This is my first experience with the AFS, and so far I've been very impressed with everything that I've heard about. And I can completely understand if different organizations are maybe reluctant to also engage with this particular issue, simply because, well, let's be positive. All of us here in this room, we don't have to worry about our work because we'll have jobs indefinitely, considering the state of the world. So in that sense, we're going to be very busy working on these issues. In terms of what to do locally, I personally, in my work, I conduct depolarization communication workshops because I'm trying to get people to talk to each other in a way that doesn't weaponize certain concepts and in a way that doesn't weaponize identity against each other. So in that sense, I believe that we need to find a way to first even start a dialogue. And starting a dialogue first means having to deconstruct everything that we've been exposed to in the media, social media, and all of the assumptions that we hold as lack of interaction with the other. So in that sense, I believe that there's many organizations out there, and I'm pretty sure AFS could take a role in that as well, in having domestic exchanges, as you said, having dinners. Somebody yesterday mentioned an example of having a dinner with people that you usually wouldn't necessarily sit down with and talk to. So I think that every single one of us, I like to work with educators a lot because I see educators as mediators of this discourse and of the polarized sides. So in that sense, I believe that we all owe it to ourselves and to our students to set a role model of exiting actively, intentionally, our own bubbles and our own choirs that we preach to.
Thank you.
Okay. There's a question in the back, and one here, so I'm not. Okay. Yes,
Well,
please.
Thank you all for your very inspiring input today, and I just wanted to get back to Maya's comment on the very important need of collecting student stories. I think that for a very long time, I mean, we've been absolutely obsessed, with assessment and getting, quantitative information. And I think we're missing a lot of very rich stories, from our students. So, I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying, turning and shifting, our paradigm and trying to get, a broader view of our students. Because many times, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, they are actually posting all those stories on Instagram, on Pinterest. Are we getting that information? Are we getting the way they perceive the world around them? I mean, I've seen that in schools. I've seen that in artwork, the way they perceive cultural differences, the way they perceive and what they want to accomplish, with global competence. I mean, stories of suffering, stories of discrimination. So are we getting that information, or are we still obsessed with figures and numbers?
I think that for some of us in Europe, getting the stories might be more difficult in the future because of the GDPR, privacy, data collection, etc. mechanisms that have been introduced. But with most of the students that I work with and most of the events that we organize, we have students together in Facebook groups. So in that sense, we are able, because we're in those groups as well, so we're able to follow some of their interaction that continues years after the initial seminar that brought them together. So in that sense, I do believe this is part of monitoring what has been born as a result of a particular interaction. And I would like us not to forget stories and not to diminish stories, because research community has dismissed stories as anecdotal evidence. Well, if it's a story of somebody's life being transformed as a result of your work, this is not anecdotal.
I would like to add something as well in terms of assessment. In the protocol that we design journals during the experience abroad. So we collect the history of this, and as well we ask the student when they come back to do a presentation mainly in front of the teacher, but we try to foster also in front of the class. And we gave them some important guidelines, some topics. And in this way, we are trying to not measure intercultural competence, but more evaluate the intercultural competence in a qualitative way. So we are using a lot of qualitative way in order to collect story like intercultural encounters that they have in that place. So, and in this way they reflect on this and they can gain more awareness on this.
Thank you very much. As we draw this discussion to a close, and particularly this last piece about stories, I am continually reminded of the power of stories, not just for assessment purposes, but as I mentioned earlier, the UNESCO project involves the use of story circles for developing intercultural competence and has been incredibly powerful as it's been tested in different regions around the world. So certainly both for assessment and for development of intercultural competence, stories can play a really key role. As we wrap this up, I am reminded of the big picture of what we're doing and how important it is to keep in mind this much bigger picture, that given the world in which we currently live in, the importance of not just developing global competence in ourselves and in others, but to what end, for what purpose. And given all that faces us, it's imperative that we work and actively resist dehumanization efforts that are currently happening around the world, and really work to connect one another, especially for those who are different from us, who may not think like us or agree with us. And AFS is certainly an organization that has a long history in doing just that, not just across borders, but we need to look at within our own societies as well. And as Francesca reminded us, this is not something we can do alone. It's something we do in partnership with others. And so thinking about who can we partner with, how do we work together in our own local communities and beyond to continue to really connect each other as humans around the world. And as we conclude, I want to leave you with a final thought from a person in my country who worked hard to actively resist dehumanization, and that was Martin Luther King Jr., when he said, we must learn to live together. We must learn to live together. It's not an option. As brothers and sisters, or perish together as fools. Now is our time. Now is our time to actively move this forward. So I want to thank you for all that you're doing. Special thank you to our panelists, Francesca, Mattia, Maja, and we look forward to the continued discussions that will occur as our next group, part 2, come to the stage. Thank you all very much for engaging with us.
Francesca and Mattia. This was a very insightful discussion. And before we move forward, I just want to mention with you that Ananta Kumar Durayappa, the director of the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, he was going to be one of their keynotes in this first panel, but he was suddenly ill and therefore not able to join us, and he sends his regrets and well wishes. And now that we talked about research on global competence and assessment, and we'll soon be welcoming the panel that will discuss successful practices in delivering programs that develop global competence, there's something I would like to share with you first. And today I'm very pleased to share great news about AFS' newest initiative to help support one of our 3 strategic impact goals, that is to expand access to intercultural education. The AFS Effect Plus program is targeted to young people who are not going on an exchange program, so trying as a way to address the challenge that Maja rightfully raised, that we need to expand access to global competence education to youth that are not going on programs, on mobility programs as well. And Effect Plus, they are interactive workshops for young people to learn about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and to discuss how they can work together to help advance them. So Effect Plus introduces teens to intercultural skills and global issues to help them improve their communication and collaboration skills, and help them better understand how they can have a role as active global citizens. In 2018, Effect Plus reached over 1,700 youth participants in 20 cities across the world. In an Effect Plus workshop in Bangalore, India, a group of 15 and 16-year-old teens focused, for example, on SDG 12, which is about responsible consumption and production, and they discussed how they could reduce waste production in their own school. On another one in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, students discussed SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities and how they could implement a recycling system in their school and in their local community. And we know that in order to scale and multiply this successful community-based program, we need partnerships, as Darla just mentioned. So AFS is partnering with international organizations looking for exciting new programs for the young participants. And we are very pleased to announce today that AFS and our friends at CISV, the Children's International Summer Villages, are proud to kick off a major grassroots joint effort, which is the Effect Plus Mosaic program. And we are adding the CISV Mosaic project approach to the AFS workshops, as we believe this will enable us to further empower young people to launch their own social impact projects in their local communities that will support to advance the SDGs. And of course, continue their journeys as active global citizens. By empowering our volunteers all around the world to take their own share of responsibility, our goal is to reach at least 5,000 young participants worldwide in the next year. And we are just getting started. So we would like your help to make an even greater effect. So you can contact me to learn more on how you can collaborate with your local AFS and CISV organizations to implement Effect Plus and help advance this Learning to Live Together movement. So now I would like to invite another friend of AFS to stage, Vande, and our second panel. He is the principal of MBV Associates and former vice president for academic affairs for the exchange organization CIAIE. Welcome.
Since we're all coming up together, I think I'll just make a few remarks to you from here rather than from the podium. One of the things I've always wanted to do at an AFS event is I've wanted to start by telling the truth, and so I'll do that this morning. For all the AFSers in the room, and for all the people who are here like me, who in some way meaningfully work with AFS, but I'll mostly say this to you AFSers, you know how to throw a really great party. So thank you for throwing another great party. It's a pleasure to be here and with my colleagues here to move here from theory and into practice. The panelists in this session represent a wide spectrum of pedagogies, tools, practices, and delivery systems for developing global competence for different age groups and for different purposes. Following the insights about the latest research developments that we've just heard about, we, the members of this panel, will now focus on what's working to achieve scale, which pathways may in fact not be scalable, and some key takeaways we should keep in mind as we work to align stakeholders to take actions that are both effective and culturally appropriate. Part of my own work as both a researcher and a practitioner in things intercultural involves helping educators bridge the considerable cultural gap between different cultural groups that exist within our own educational institutions and organizations. I'm thinking, for example, among other things, of the work that I do that involves bringing together people from different cultural groups, each of which regards the way that they do cultural competence as essentially the right way. So I'm thinking, for instance, of mobility, people who are committed to mobility within institutions and organizations. People whose paradigm, to use a word that we heard in the last session, whose basic assumptions concern things like the development of individuals, the transformation, again, to use a term that we heard from the last session. The individual transformation is a focus of the work in that area, and quite appropriately. And to bring those colleagues representing those cultural values and beliefs and assumptions together with colleagues from multicultural education, from what is oftentimes referred to as diversity and inclusion groups, whose focus, rather than on individual transformation, is on social justice, whose focus concerns the application of power and privilege, the inequities that are visited upon people who fall outside power and privilege. Now, from my perspective, these are simply two different ways, very good ways, very legitimate ways, of exercising global competence, but we do tend to live in these silos, I'll use that term, sometimes very hardened silos, and that those of us who are doing diversity and inclusion work, multicultural work, or those of us who are doing international mobility work, we have a tendency to be judgmental about people who are doing the other kind of work. What can we do as educators to draw bridges, to build bridges between these silos? I think is a critical part of our work at this point. I'll mention another silo, or silos, that for me came out of that last discussion, and that is the importance in doing assessment work that we recognize that there are qualitative researchers who are doing very good work, who are passionately engaged with the individual stories of learners. It's a wonderful application of assessment. And there are other equally talented researchers and practitioners who are committed to quantitative work. And we hear a lot about mixed methodology today in assessment. How do we effectively do mixed methodology? I think it starts with us not being judgmental. If we are a quantitative researcher, not being judgmental about qualitative work, and if we're qualitative, not being judgmental about quantitative work. So these kinds of basic differences that occur within our organizations are something that I, as a researcher and as a practitioner, work on myself. And now turning to us. I hope that we can discuss today what sorts of leadership are needed to transform these kinds of divergent practices, philosophies, approaches, in a multifaceted movement that is competence, broadly speaking, global competence, a movement that allows us to meet our philosophies and approaches and to address this goal, and I'm quoting here from AFS work, quote, to provide as a standard part of our learning and education systems more people with the knowledge, skills, and understanding to effectively and peacefully live, work, study, and hopefully join together to make the world a much better place for all. And while we're doing this, let's touch on the role, if we can, that technology plays in ways that we never could have imagined just 5 years ago, especially in remote and underdeveloped regions of the world. So, Tony, I'll turn to you and say Dr. Tony Jackson is the Vice President for Education of the Asia Society, an educational organization dedicated to promoting mutual understanding and strengthening partnerships among peoples, leaders, and institutions of Asia and the United States in a global context. He oversees the Asia Society's Center for Global Education, which the center itself describes as, quote, a platform for collaboratively advancing education for global competence for all. So, Tony, please briefly describe for us the mission of the Asia Society's Center for Global Education and your approach to taking a leadership role in scaling global education.
Sure, thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me here. This is a great conference, and I'm really glad to be here. I would say, to describe what we do, 15 years ago, under then the President of Asia Society, Nick Platt, and certainly even more so under Vishaka Desai's leadership later on, we considered the question, how has the world changed? And how does education need to change to enable young people to really thrive within a global economic environment, but also particularly within an increasingly diverse environment in their own communities and in the world? And so we really have done, I think, kind of two main bodies of work towards that end. One, I would say, comes under the guise of the role of thought leadership. We've done a lot of work in the last 15 years in trying to really define what we mean by global competence and what the sub-competencies are that go with that. And so we've developed a framework that speaks to the issue of four key dimensions around global competence: investigating the world, which are the intellectual and cognitive skills to be able to frame an issue within a global context and to use resources from around the world to develop an argument or response to a global issue. But then also the social and emotional aspects of it, the ability to recognize perspectives and weigh others' perspectives, the ability to communicate and collaborate across cultures, and then importantly to also be able to use what you've learned to apply and to take action in the world for the common good and to know the consequences of that work. So we put together that framework, and that's been guiding our work really for the last 15 years, and it's also, I think, been somewhat influential in other folks' thinking about global competence. I would just mention this report from OECD that we did with OECD called Teaching for Global Competence in a Rapidly Changing World, Essentially, this is OECD's framework for global competence, which if you'll dive into that, you'll see it's very closely aligned to ours. And so they drew on our work, Darla's work, others, to put together a framework that winds up being pretty close to the way we thought of it. So we've advanced the idea of global competence, advocated for it, but also what we've done a lot of work around is to really think about how do we help teachers and educators in the informal learning space know how to teach for global competence. And so we devoted a lot of work towards developing the tools for professional development that we think teachers need to be able to teach for global competence and integrate that into their work in a really seamless way. And so particularly focusing on a kind of project-based approach to teaching that uses global issues, drawn particularly from the Sustainable Development Goals, as a way to frame and reframe curriculum within the disciplines and teach algebra or history or whatever in the context of looking at a global problem. We've helped develop the professional learning tools that allow teachers to know how to do that. And to your point about scale, we've done this kind of professional development with teachers largely on a face-to-face basis in our work in the United States and some elsewhere in Asia particularly. But increasingly we realized if we really want to affect tens of thousands of teachers and through them millions of students, we need to develop a digital version of what we do. So we've essentially worked with Arizona State University and with another organization called Area 9 to begin to think about how do you actually put together online workshops that are interactive, that use adaptive learning, that actually support teachers in developing the capacity to teach for global competence anywhere, any place in the world, suitably adapted to the local context. And so also in joining those folks who are in those courses, those online courses and communities of practice so they can work and talk with each other. We're trying to think about ways we can take this movement forward and really particularly focus on teacher professional development as the key, we think, to being able to move this worldwide.
Tony, that's fascinating, and I'm sure that we'll have a chance, I hope we have a chance to return to a little bit of this. That's fascinating, thank you. George, you have tackled teacher education in a variety of ways throughout your career. You are Associate Professor of Utrecht Lorand University, a board member of the Association for Teacher Education in Europe. What challenges and opportunities do you see as the biggest ones in preparing more educators to teach in diverse, multicultural, and sometimes segregated classrooms today?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me for this wonderful conference. It's very interesting to see how different ideas and concepts are gathered here, and the different knowledge and practice. Actually, in the Association for Teacher Education in Europe, we would like to gather practitioners and researchers together. I am myself a practitioner, an activist, a teacher, and a researcher together, and I am often reflecting on my own practice. But this is often a very, we consider this a very important competence of teachers to reflect on their own practice, but it's not so easy, and I can see it even in my research. I'm doing research with vulnerable populations like Roma students or schools where teachers, I worked in segregated Roma schools before, and I'm now researching, for example, a school near a ghetto. And where teachers trying to implement a special intercultural education project in the school using mainly the concept of identity. So they are trying to reinforce students' identities, and the problem is that it doesn't really work because in that environment this is not the answer. This cannot really offer a proper answer to the students' problem, everyday problems. And so I'm advocating a bit a larger picture to reflect on the system, on society, how the different factors of the system that we live in, social and economic system, especially capitalism, is influencing our ways of thinking about students and teachers. For example, I think there is a danger that we are talking about education a lot, and it's important, of course, even in developing global competence and competencies and intercultural competencies. On the other hand, this is the danger that we might put too much burden on the shoulders of teachers. They are all, and we are all encapsulated in the system, so we cannot change really the word. And this is critical for me to understand it, and we should be humble in a certain way and say, okay, let's see what is around us. And that reflection is not easy to facilitate in teachers, because teachers are often in their teaching programs led to reflect on psychological factors of students, individual factors of students. So it's not easy to help them to reflect on the social, the wider picture. But I think that's an important goal for teacher educators like me to help the future teachers in this engagement, and I'm trying to do that during my work too. So it's important to deal with the question of power, with the question of social circumstances, everyday life of students, and the system that surrounds us. Thank you.
Thank you, Gers. Really fascinating thinking about questioning, reflecting on our own assumptions. Thanks very much. Jenny King is the Director of Culture and Education at the British Council in Hungary. The British Council is a major convener of stakeholders, like-minded and sometimes not, for discussing and debating important issues like the one we're talking about this morning. Jenny, will you please briefly describe your work at the British Council and the role the Council plays in helping more people from different backgrounds learn to live and work together at the local and national levels in a hands-on way?
Sure. It's always difficult to describe the British Council because it is such an unwieldy and huge beast of an organization, and Hungary is just one of 100, 110 physical offices that we have around the world. But I think it's really interesting to anchor it in the British Council's past, for those who might not know. The organization was originally founded just before World War II as a response to the growth of fascism across Europe. And the article in our original founding charter is to create friendly knowledge and understanding between peoples of the world. Now, it's a really fascinating juncture in world history at the moment to reflect on the parallels that you might see between 1930s Europe and the state of nationalism worldwide, as was mentioned in the previous panel. In 1939, the British Council organized an arts exhibition in Germany before the break of World War II. It just shows how two entirely different parallel universes can exist at once. One is the diplomatic, political sphere, and the other is what's happening between individuals, institutions, and systems, education systems, cultural systems. There are so many programs that I could comment on from our portfolio. I feel like I fall down the rabbit hole every time I try and choose which ones to talk about. So instead, I thought I would reflect on how, in my experience, we've designed programs. Hungary is not the only posting I've worked in. I've also been in the Middle East extensively. And I think that there is a huge risk, and it's well-intentioned, but there is a risk that we view intercultural learning as physical exchange or face-to-face engagement. And the reality is that the vast majority of people worldwide will never leave the cities that they grew up in, the towns that they grew up in, and they might also never want to. So the assumption is that if you give people an opportunity, they'll always want to study or work or trade or travel overseas. And actually, not everybody feels that impetus. Now, does that mean that there's no way for them to become part of an intellectual global community or to access ideas that are international? We would obviously say no, but it is an entirely different way of thinking about programs. In the past, you might have thought of British Council as the Chevening scholarships or things that were very tangible, overseas trips. And we do lots of work that is face-to-face. But actually, I think when you're talking about assessment or what you want people to go on and do, we often think too much about action and knowledge. And I would say it's much more about perception and self-identity. You know, I grew up in London, so I always situated my identity in an international way because it's such a global city. But there are many, many contexts with people where they never come into direct relation with otherness. So when I'm designing a program around social cohesion, for example, I try and break it down into 4 constituent areas. And they are exposure, experience, skills, and then appetite and incentive. And if I very, very briefly state what they mean to me, when you're talking about experience and exposure, the first is, are they even aware that other ideas exist? Many people are not. They actually don't know that there are alternatives to their perspectives. It's not because they think they're closed-minded. They just don't know that there are alternative opinions out there. So are they exposed to different ideas? How much experience do they have of engaging meaningfully with those other ideas? Do they have the skills to digest, interpret, reflect on, articulate their responses to those ideas? So those are physical skills, what we would call core skills around media literacy or critical thinking or problem solving. And then crucially at the end, appetite and incentive. Do they see any value in being part of that conversation? And I think that's often where we're losing the battle, is that we have not managed to make the case for if you don't ever want to leave your village, and if you are very proud of your national roots, quite rightly, do you see any tangible benefit of engaging with otherness or being part of the conversation around the Sustainable Development Goals? And what mechanisms do we have at our disposal to make that case to people? I know we're supposed to keep our answers very short, so I do have examples, but maybe you might want to come back to them.
Maybe we can come back to them. I think it's fascinating to think once again about challenging some of our basic assumptions, and that the challenge of those assumptions, our reflection on our assumptions, challenging the assumptions, kind of easy understandings we've developed, and then using that to develop our programming. It's fascinating. Thank you. Daniel Obst is, of course, the president and CEO of AFS Intercultural Programs. It's a pleasure to be with you again, Daniel. And I wonder if you could speak with us a little bit about how AFS is taking a lead in helping the world of international education, study abroad, and exchange programs scale the global competence movement, including using technology and virtual exchanges.
Thanks very much, Mick. And Jenny, you said you were fired up. You are. I'd love to hear more. And I really love what the British Council is doing as also a legacy organization to really develop and change your course and direction. I would say on our end, on the AFS front, the interpersonal face-to-face dialogue is one of the key things that we want to pursue. But from my perspective, it doesn't necessarily have to mean international travel. And I think this is where the question of scale comes in. And I think a comment was made on the earlier panel is, how do we afford to get more people abroad? We have to fundraise for it. We have to incentivize and mobilize governments and corporations and foundations to invest in it. But it will only get us so far. So we are now starting to think about how do we reach more people. Our key objective is to expand access to intercultural education, which is something we have to do. And there's several different ways of how we can accomplish that. One is through technology. I would say at AFS we're very new to virtual exchange. The jury is out how it will work for us, but there are a couple ways of how we're trying it. I know that AFS India, for example, has developed a virtual classroom exchange with Russia, Mexico, and a couple other countries. We are now also next month convening in China through AFS China a discussion on how we could develop a one global classroom initiative to connect multiple classrooms around the world. And the benefit there is not to restrict travel, but to infuse global education, global competence, intercultural learning into the classroom, support teachers, and so on. And maybe it will also lead to mobility down the line. And the second piece I would say is how can we actually improve the intercultural learning and the outcomes of those who are already going abroad. And so this is something where we have developed a couple years ago the Global Competence Certificate Program, which really was something that we developed for our own students, especially those who study abroad in the college level or do internship or volunteering abroad, to create facilitated and intentional educational content in those study abroad experiences. It's a blended learning course, 18 modules, now in 7 languages. We've just passed the 5,000 participant mark. Developed great partnerships with Purdue University and the Diplomatic Corps in Belgium. But I think what is important there is that we're seeing now from the research that the outcomes in terms of your intercultural learning are improving. So I think that has to be as much our objective as reaching more people, but also improving the experience.
The GCC is one of the more exciting developments that I've seen in terms of putting theory into practice. And then once again, I think what we're seeing here is we're questioning some long-standing assumptions. An assumption here being that more or less automatically that people, by virtue of becoming mobile, by going to a different country, more or less automatically develop intercultural competence. And research indicates that that's not necessarily the case. And so what you're doing is you are seeking ways, in fact, to enhance global learning in contexts where we can't automatically assume that the learning is taking place. Thanks very much. Let's turn quickly now to some more questions, and I'm going to ask a couple of you a question. And Tony and Daniel, I'm going to ask each of you this question. Developing networks, partnerships, and alliances is critical to creating alignment and building momentum to fuel any type of social, cultural movement, including, of course, this one. Please provide some insights from your organization's experiences in building bridges that allow your organizations to move complex issues forward. Start with you, Tony.
Sure, and to that question, I want to bring your attention and all of our attention to a new report that just came out this week at the United Nations General Assembly. It's called Investing in Knowledge Sharing to Advance SDG 4. And this is done, there was 4 groups that authored this report. The Center for Global Education was one, Results for Development, Teach for All, I know colleagues are here from Teach for All, as well as WISE, and the Boston Consulting Group, if I didn't mention them. And the point of this was really to develop a framework for what we mean by building bridges, what we mean by building alliances, and what do they require to really actually be powerful. And sort of encapsulate what the key findings are, they found that there really are 3 important things that are required for a really effective alliance. One are what are called global public goods, or things, data, methodologies, tools that have been developed, some in one location, but they have applicability in other locations. So they're sort of universally valuable kinds of resources that can be adapted and used in different cultures and different contexts. And secondly, there is capacity building, enabling the people who are going to be using these public goods to really know how to use them well, how they can be adapted to their context, and really developing the wherewithal to be able to use these resources well in their own worlds. And thirdly, networks, making sure that you have ways of connecting resource providers, in-state users, and capacity builders in alliances where they're able to share knowledge and build knowledge together over time. And so these are the critical elements then of what we mean by a network and a partnership that really come together to really make one powerful. And I'll just say that at Asia Society, we've tried to do this in our own work as well, particularly in something called the International Studies Schools Network, where essentially we've created lots of resources that I mentioned before, teacher professional development resources. We've then helped to capacitate school educators through lots of professional training, and then have them all be part of networks, of knowledge-sharing networks across the United States, and increasingly globally, so that they can actually help each other learn and work together over time. So these sort of core elements of what an alliance looks like, I think, really helps us figure out how do we make sure that the alliances and partnerships we are developing really work and work well for all people involved.
And I would say from my perspective, it's all about collective impact, right? We talk about this global competence initiative as a movement, and how can we achieve our shared goals if we work in parallel, essentially. So I think from my perspective, the partnerships that work best are the ones where you have shared missions and are aligned, but where you have different expertise that can build on each other. And so just to give a couple examples, one on the advocacy side, where AFS, our European umbrella organization, the European Federation for International Learning, partnered with the European umbrella organization for Youth for Understanding to advocate for more student mobility, more funding, credit recognition, and so on. And so often, our organizations may actually compete for resources or compete for students on our programs, but let's band together, because then the whole movement will benefit. Another example that Anna Carolina mentioned earlier is the Effect Plus initiative. How can we reach thousands of students through these empowering workshops on global citizenship? And so the new partnership with CISV is one of them, you know, so we can extend our reach to new countries, to new schools, to new audiences. And so the last example I would give is Teach for All. You mentioned Teach for All. One of our key priorities is expanding access to intercultural learning. So how do we reach into the most underserved school districts around the world, into schools that have maybe no access to global competence education or international engagement? And so we have a new partnership with them, and a great example is the work that AFS Austria is doing with Teach for Austria on identifying scholarship students in those schools. So this is an effect where we essentially are different organizations, but we have a shared goal and mission and can achieve better collective impact.
It's fascinating to think about collaborating with what we have traditionally looked upon as competitors. Thank you for that. And very quickly, I do want to capture George and then Jenny. I want to capture very quickly, if we can, a couple of things before we turn this over to the audience. So I'll start with you. What are some of the things that education authorities don't understand about internationalizing education, global education, and global competence? What hampers education authorities from getting it?
Well, I think it's a complex and difficult question, and I think we should understand again the complex and systemic reasons. For example, in the previous panel it was mentioned to this increasing tendencies of nationalism and populism, and how authorities and governments responding to that, like the Hungarian government. The Hungarian government is embedded in a world system, and a lot of people following this discourse are not simply just having prejudices, but they are trying this discourse is very much in this sense of economic problems, for example. So I think it's very important to see the complex picture. That's all that I would like to say now, because I really want to hear some questions from the audience.
Okay. Thank you for that. And Jenny, I am intrigued to learn that you're a champion debater and that you lead debating workshops. Meaningful and productive debate is critical to building partnerships, networks, and alliances, and to helping others better understand perspectives that they don't agree with. What are some key strategies and points that you'd like to share with us to make the debate around issues that we're discussing throughout the conference more enlightened, purposeful, and effective?
Champion debater might be an overstatement, but I'll take it. I'll put it on my business cards. People have already talked about empathy. Ultimately, empathy is crucial in any really successful debate that you see. They find a way to not convince the audience, but rather to situate themselves in the audience and then almost speak back to themselves. I would also say that there is a really big difference between being right and being persuasive. And you know, we talk about debate, and debate is a formal structure of facilitating a dialogue, and often it's parliamentary style debate, which is very antagonistic and has lots of accusation at the foundation of it. That's very different from persuasion. And we were told when we came on stage today to steer away from jargon, which is such an important steer. And I think often when we're making speeches or we're talking about the importance of internationalism, we are so sure that we are right in that, because we have the best of intentions in that process. But are you leaving the room with everyone in the audience understanding what you've said, or are you leaving the room with everyone in the audience thinking that it was said very eloquently? And often we're so concerned about making sure that it's presented in a way which is articulate, and rather than getting down into the nitty-gritty of whether you're actually persuading people, or having mutuality in dialogue. And I think mutuality is also one of those things that we talk about a lot. We pay lip service to it a lot, but actually many people feel that values are being imposed on them. So the idea of universal values, which is talked about all the time, or shared values, actually a lot of people don't find the idea of universal values appealing. They actually find it off-putting. And we assume that universal values is a very optimistic thing, and it is, for me, but that as a term can be much more loaded for somebody else. So rather than saying, I'm here to preach universal values to you, I'm sure you have them, they're lurking there somewhere, we'll find them by the end of this debate. It's much more, okay, well, what do you think your values are? Let's meet on equal terms, and I'm not here to lecture you, I'm here to engage honestly with what you feel.
And how condescending that feels when we begin a debate and say,
right.
I know that at the end we will agree, right. Meaning the way I see things, you're eventually going to come around to my way of seeing things, right?
Exactly,
exactly. Yeah, thank you very much. We've got time, I think, for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So if we could now encourage questions, that would be great for our panelists.
Hello,
Hello.
Catherine Turner with Global Citizen LLC Consulting. Thank you so much for this incredibly vibrant conversation. I want to come back to your point, Jenny. I was working internationally primarily, and then now I'm working again in the United States and wanting to bridge the global and local work. And to me, it's so exciting to be in a conference of people who are all speaking global competence, and we all kind of are speaking the same language, even though we use different terms. I find in my work in global public health, in community work, in equity, diversity, and inclusion work, that when I use the term global competence, people don't know what I mean. So I have to do a lot of explaining and sometimes persuading. But I was surprised by how much resistance I'm finding to the idea of global competence and how global competence fits in with other disciplines like public health or like equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And that is, in particular, the equity, diversity, and inclusion work that's really been framed in a very national way, a very domestic way, and not in a global way. And so I'd love to have more conversation and hear more ideas about how we can really foster a better understanding of global competence and also how we might be persuasive in terms of and help educate people about the importance of and the value, as you were saying, for people who don't want to leave their towns and cities. What's the value for them in becoming more interculturally engaged and aware? Thank you.
Did you have a question? That was a wonderful comment, and I hope that during the rest of the conference that we're able to pursue some of these. Is there
my question was about asking for more ideas about how we can engage more people in the population. In particular, we've talked a lot about young people, which is an incredibly important segment of the population to focus on. I find a lot of resistance coming from middle-aged people and older people, and in particular from people who are more situated in their towns and cities and don't leave their states or don't leave their countries. So how can we engage more with the broader population around the value of intercultural exchange and awareness?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Comments?
Yeah, I would, there's the phrase that we use in our social enterprise portfolio, so just to explain, we work across civil society, arts and culture, education, so the full gamut. But in our social enterprise work, we always use the phrase, think global, act local. And I love that phrase because I think that it counters some of the misconceptions that people might have, which is that by encouraging global competence, we want everyone to move overseas, or we want to have these very porous societies, or everything, you know, suddenly the makeup of your community is going to change. And actually, it's not necessarily about that. And by taking international ideas, so we actually have a Connecting Classrooms program. It was interesting to hear you say that, and we do exactly that with teachers, is that just by getting access to interesting, creative, innovative ideas overseas, they're going to improve the public schools in their local area. It's not about them working on education in some remote, abstract way. It's about their kids here on the ground and them taking some good practice from somewhere else, or having a dialogue about good practice with teachers from a completely different context. So I don't know whether that's a useful phrase or a convincing phrase for other people, but that might be one way to approach it, is that it's not always about going external or having to go overseas. It's about taking things and bringing them back to build stronger communities locally. And also the otherness, I think this was mentioned in the other panel, the otherness doesn't necessarily mean ethnic and racial and religious otherness. It's also socioeconomic background. It's urban, rural, it's geographic. And a lot of that is domestic. And the case to be made for having stronger, more resilient communities and individuals at the local level is you make the case that, well, that has a better economy, a more inclusive economy. That's vital. Inclusive economic growth is essential. Internationalism or international ideas are essential for inclusive economic growth. So that's also maybe an argument that can be made.
That's great, and also this ties us in back once again into the use of technology, the reliance on technology. And I can't help but recall, Daniel, your observation that we still really don't know what the impact of these experiments are, how important assessment is in our work as we carry this out of our local communities to other local communities and then try to assess the impact on all the communities that are involved there. It's heady business, but it's really important that we do that work. I wonder if you'd care to comment on that, Daniel.
I just want to pick up actually on something that you said, but that also the questioner said, which I think is quite fascinating, right? Because the conference is called Global Competence and all this. So are we branding a term because we want to build a field, a discipline out of this? Or do we need to use the language in different contexts where it resonates most, So often we at AFS talk about learning to live together, which, resonates with people in a much more emotional way. In the academic context, or when we talk to corporations, we should talk about global competence or global skills, So I think we do have to be open to adjusting the way we actually talk about this, and maybe the 144 different definitions isn't necessarily a terrible thing.
No, and I'll use that and dovetail off of that into some closing comments, because I see that we are unfortunately running out of time. We have a tendency, I think, in educational circles, we have a tendency to need to come back to a definite definition. I think that's a very different paradigm. I think definitions always contain values, and the values that are promoted through a slogan, through a brand, through a definition, potentially contain power and privilege over people who can't benefit in the way that reality is being defined. The 144 definitions is in fact a characteristic of the world that we live in today. Somehow we need to be able to mediate and moderate, if necessary, people's responses to that reality. The multiplicity of things is before us. And I'm going to round off and make one last comment. Thank you so much for the contributions that you've made. This has been an enlightening and an invigorating conversation. And what we're talking about, of course, here is we're talking about the practice from theory. A takeaway for me in listening to the four of you is the extent to which each one of you is talking about reflecting on self, questioning current assumptions, questioning the narratives that bind us together in communities, questioning the paradigms that we've inherited from previous generations, and how necessary that is in our work as educators, that the work begins with us, that the practice begins in the development of global competency within each of us, which, as I understand it, involves at least four simple, or perhaps not so simple things. One is that continuing reflection on who I am. What are the sources of my own identity? What is my experience, ultimately, of the world? How do I make sense of the world? Where did that come from? Who has helped me come to this? What are the communities that I participate in? That's the first. The second is, how about you? How about each of you? How do you make sense of the world? Where did that come from? What is your experience of the world? And as I begin to experience those two things, my sense of the world, your sense of the world, I begin to understand how very different our meaning-making of the world is. And therefore, the importance somehow of each of us as we talk with each other and encounter the other, and how different and sometimes threatening that other can be. How do we then come to equanimity as we encounter the other? How do we, in that moment, live in this moment, leaving aside our preoccupations, our biases, our own assumptions, and say, in this moment we can coexist, we can be together. And then having done that, having found equanimity, how can we then, in fact, engage in this business of bridging across the differences? So I think on that note, I have the privilege of being able to speak last in a situation like this, so that's the last point. And I just want to really thank our panel this morning for this really interesting and really helpful conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.